The government has outlined its plans to commemorate the centenary of the First World War, which include commemorative services, a candlelit vigil and a guarantee that 2 pupils and a teacher from every secondary school in England will be sent to visit the French and Belgian battlefields. But the plans are not without controversy. Yesterday, the Community Secretary Eric Pickles said it would be a tremendous tragedy if the commemorations became an anti-German or anti-Turkish festival. And the government has now been criticised for failing to comment on the causes of the war. Many historians do lay the blame squarely at the feet of Germany. More than twice as many servicemen perished in the First World War as the Second. In total, an estimated 8 million soldiers lost their lives, with nearly 1 million of those being from the British Empire. So should we, 100 years on, be able to celebrate the victory that they died for without the risk of offending Germans? Or with a war so bloody and tragic, is it totally unhelpful to try 100 years on to attribute blame, to celebrate any part of a conflict that was really a battle between imperial nations, all equally fighting for global power? We're joined by 2 historians, Sir Max Hastings, war historian and journalist, definitely doesn't want it to be neutral, and Neil Faulkner runs many First World War archaeology projects around the world and is editor of Military History Monthly. Sir Max, first of all, you're concerned at the drift of this?
I don't think, when I heard you use the word celebration, Jeremy, a minute ago, nobody in their right mind could celebrate the First World War, which was a catastrophe for Europe and for Britain. That where some of us, Hugh Strawn, for instance, and Sir Michael Howard, who are probably Britain's 2 most distinguished historians of the First World War, are uneasy about the way that the government, this non-judgmental approach, is that don't we have a responsibility to try to educate a new generation about why the war happened? That nobody, from the Prime Minister downwards, hesitates to say in World War II, we fought Hitler and the great evil of Nazism, and we were on the right side. Now, in the First World War, again, nobody can suggest that you associate today's Germany, a great democracy, with what happened 100 years ago. But the overwhelming weight of evidence shows that the militarist autocracy led by the Kaiser in 1914 did represent a huge threat to the peace and democracy of Europe and of Britain, and that it was absolutely right. We were on the right side. We were the good guys, and that the government and those who are running the commemoration shouldn't be afraid to say that yes, it was ghastly. No triumphalism, please. How could anyone be triumphalist about this great catastrophe? But let us try and tell a new generation the facts, that it was as important that the soldiers of the First World War who died made that sacrifice and made that extraordinary contribution to defeat the Germany of 1914 as it was to defeat the Germany of 1939-45.
Okay. Neil Faulkner, can you just remind us how the First World War began?
Well, it began with a series of mobilisations which were triggering one another, with the different great powers very concerned as their opponents mobilised that if they didn't also match that, their countries would get invaded and they would get defeated before they could get their soldiers into action. Now, you have to put that, I think, in the context of a massive militarisation of Europe in the run-up to the war. And that, in turn, is a reflection of the way in which tensions between these imperial powers had been rising. One of the problems with Max talking about the facts is the facts are contested, and I certainly don't agree with the view that Britain's rulers were on the right side in the First World War.
You think it was a bit like, to massively oversimplify it, a fight in a pub where everyone's armed and this thing kicks off with what was the assassination of Austria's Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, but it could have been anything.
It absolutely kicks off in an uncontrollable way, but I think what's also true is that Britain and France were defending existing empires against Germany trying to build one, and all of Europe's rulers were imperialists. All of Europe's rulers were in it for what they could gain. All of Europe's rulers represented the interests of giant corporations that stood to profit from redividing the world. This was the age of European imperialism.
So we were all equally to blame, you say?
I agree with a little bit of what Neil said, that it's certainly true that all the European powers were imperialists, but a very simple truth, in 1914, the British did not want a war, and Germany was willing for a war. And when he says the facts are disputed, there are 2 facts that are not in dispute. One is that Austria was the first to. Austria wanted to have a war to crush Serbia for reasons we don't need to confuse everybody too much by going into. But Austria wanted a war to crush Serbia, and the Germans promised Austria support for that war. Now, at any time, if Germany in July 1914 had said to the Austrians, we will not support the war that you are starting against Serbia, then there would not have, all that followed would not have followed. And that simple fact that Germany had the power to stop the disaster of war and didn't exercise it, that is a fact that no historian can argue with.
Neil Faulkner.
I don't think it's an argument about that. I think the question is, it's not about who fires the first shot. It's actually about the fact that Germany felt that the militarization of her imperial competitors meant that it was in her interest to fight sooner rather than later. But that's a reflection of a context in which these imperial powers are competing with each other and militarizing in opposition to each other.
But so Germany was committed to the dominance of Europe.
I don't think that Germany was any more committed to the dominance of Europe than Britain was committed to the control of her maritime empire.
Well, that seems to be the point where the two of you part company, where, Max, you think our empire wasn't really the driving force for Britain, is that right?
I think there's a half-truth in what Neil's just said, but it was certainly true that the British were keen to sustain the status quo because they were top dog. But again, I come back to the point, the British, nobody can sensibly accuse Britain of wanting a war in 1914, and the Germans were willing for that war. And while, yes, of course, I don't think, I heard a German historian a couple of years ago describe the July crisis of 1914 as the most complicated series of events in modern history, and I think that's absolutely true. So we all have to be careful about oversimplifying, but at the same time, in the end, one has to come to the judgment. If Germany had won the First World War, I would stick to the view most firmly, and so would all the historians that I respect, that it would have been a catastrophe for democracy in Western Europe.
Well, often people say of the Second World War that if we hadn't won it with America's help, we would all be speaking German. Is it fair to say that about the First World War, Max?
I think what you can say, you can't totally equate the Kaiser's Germany with Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany was committed to the genocide against the Jews, which the Kaiser's Germany wasn't. But the Kaiser's Germany was a militarized autocracy, and I think its victory, the way it started the war, by killing 6,000 innocent civilians in Belgium and northern France, not just in the course of battle, but as hostages or executions for alleged reprisals for imaginary guerrilla activity. Germany in 1914, it was a pretty nasty place. What everyone says about the other Western European powers, France, Britain and so on, they were genuine democracies in a way that Germany was not. If Germany had won, we would all have been very, very sorry. And I think that bears saying in this commemoration.
There was no democracy in the British Empire, and you know the British were willing to shoot down demonstrators in Ireland, in Egypt, and in India.
Come on, this is what I call the flagellator, the sort of masochistic school of British history. And I do think, Max, that it is awfully sad when I hear somebody like yourself, the determination to win a headline by rubbishing Britain is so depressing.
Okay, Neil.
Let me make the point. The British were happy with the status quo because they already ruled a quarter of humanity. Of course they were happy with the status quo, and there was absolutely no question of any democracy or independence in the British Empire.
Do you think there's a danger, Neil, of this anniversary commemoration being celebrated by the wrong people or lots of people?
I think it's inevitable that it will be contested, and I think what I can say is that those of us who are involved in the Stop the War movement will be actively involved in putting an alternative message that we should understand the lessons and we should use those lessons to promote a world of peace and democracy and solidarity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Neil Faulkner, who runs many First World War archaeology projects, and Sir Max Hastings, war historian on the other side of the fence, journalist as well.